Did you know that more than 50% of the world's population lives under some form of government that limits freedom? That's right. In many countries, the concept of freedom is just an illusion, whether it's in a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime. But there's one huge difference between these systems: fascism and democracy. While both are forms of government, they couldn't be more different when it comes to how power is used and how citizens are treated. In this video, we'll break down the key differences between fascism and democracy. You'll be shocked to learn how fascist leaders have used fear and manipulation to control entire populations. But don't worry, democracy has its own unique set of strengths that protect individual freedom. By the end, you'll have a clearer understanding of why these two systems are at odds and how they shape the world today. Stay with us as we dive into the world of power, control, and freedom. Chapter 1: The Origins of Power. From people to dictators. When we look at political systems, it's important to understand where power begins and how it spreads. In democracy, power starts with the people. It's the citizens who vote, choose leaders, and influence policy. In countries with strong democratic traditions, this process has been shaped by centuries of development. For example, the United States, founded in 1776, put the idea of government by the people at the center of its design. But what about fascism? Fascism, on the other hand, is built on the idea that power comes from a single leader, or a small, tightly controlled group. Think of Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany. Fascist movements rise when people feel that the government is failing to solve their problems, and a leader promises to fix everything. This leader, however, often rises by exploiting fear, frustration, and national crisis. Hitler, for instance, used the aftermath of World War I to fuel his rise, convincing Germans that they needed a strong man to restore order. Democracies can also be born out of crisis, but they work by creating systems to ensure no one person holds all the power. It's like a delicate balance, an idea often pushed by philosophers like Montesquieu, who said the best governments divide power into different branches. That's why, in a democracy, the president or prime minister doesn't have the final say in everything. The legislative and judicial branches check their power. Contrast that with fascism, where a single voice dominates everything. Fascist leaders use speeches and mass rallies to convince people that their leadership is the only solution. This is not just theory, we saw it firsthand in the 20th century. According to historian Robert Paxton, fascism exploits a crisis and promises a solution that seems impossible in any other system. In the end, democracy encourages the idea of power belonging to the people, while fascism sees power as the privilege of one person or a select group. Chapter 2: The Illusion of Freedom. How rights are manipulated. The concept of freedom is central to any political system, but it's treated very differently in fascism and democracy. In a democracy, freedom means a set of rights guaranteed by law. People are free to express their opinions, choose their leaders, and live without fear of unjust punishment. But how do you define freedom in a fascist state? In a fascist society, freedom is an illusion. Sure, you might hear the word freedom tossed around, but in reality, it's used to justify control. Fascist regimes often promise a return to glory, nationalism, or safety, and they claim that personal freedoms must be sacrificed for the greater good. Take North Korea, for example. The country's leader often speaks about the freedom of the people, but in reality, it's a tightly controlled system where dissent is punished. Propaganda is a key tool in this system, with the state controlling nearly every form of communication, from the news to entertainment. A famous quote from Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels captures this: "The most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over." In contrast, democracies focus on protecting individual freedoms. In a healthy democracy, you can speak your mind, challenge the government, and live your life as you choose, within the boundaries of the law. A free press is one of the key ways to hold governments accountable, and this is something that fascism tries to destroy. In fact, 87% of fascist regimes throughout history have restricted the press. The people are told what to believe, not encouraged to think for themselves. Chapter 3: Leaders or Tyrants. Who's in charge? In any political system, leadership plays a critical role, but how it operates is vastly different in fascism and democracy. In fascism, the leader is not just a figurehead, they are the absolute authority. Mussolini's famous quote, "Everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state," is the perfect encapsulation of how fascists view leadership. There's no room for debate or dissent in this vision. One leader makes all the decisions, and their will is law. The power of a single leader is often bolstered by a strong military and police force, which are used to maintain control and suppress opposition. By contrast, democracy operates on the principle of shared leadership. It's a system where no one person is above the law. This is why the US Constitution established a system of checks and balances, where different branches of government can challenge each other. In a democracy, leadership is about serving the people, not ruling over them. This system relies on elections, and leaders are held accountable by voters. If the people don't like a leader's performance, they can vote him out of office. This contrasts sharply with fascism, where leaders often stay in power through fear, manipulation, and violence. Interestingly, history shows us that fascist leaders are often portrayed as heroes in their own time, promising to restore order and pride to a nation. But once in power, they often become tyrants who suppress opposition, silence critics, and consolidate their power. A 2017 study by the Human Rights Watch showed that countries with fascist governments are far more likely to have human rights abuses. Democracy, though imperfect, provides mechanisms for removing corrupt or tyrannical leaders through fair and free elections. As Winston Churchill once said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. This is the heart of the difference. In democracy, leaders are accountable. In fascism, leaders dominate. Chapter 4: Mass Manipulation. The power of propaganda. One of the most powerful tools in fascism is propaganda. It's not just about spreading information, it's about shaping the way people think and feel. In a fascist system, leaders use propaganda to create an image of strength, unity, and purpose. Hitler, for example, was a master of using propaganda to control the German people. His rallies, speeches, and even films like Triumph of the Will were designed to make people believe they were part of something much bigger than themselves. The idea was simple: manipulate emotions and control the narrative. In contrast, democratic societies have mechanisms to fight against propaganda. A free press allows multiple viewpoints to be heard, and political debate is encouraged. However, even in democracies, propaganda can find its way into public discourse. Political campaigns often use slogans and media strategies to sway voters, but in democratic systems, the line is drawn at manipulation and deceit. The freedom of speech and press is protected, and while bias exists, the public can usually access a variety of sources to form an informed opinion. One major difference between the two systems is the degree of censorship. In fascism, the state controls almost every aspect of communication. In fact, during World War II, Nazi Germany had a whole department dedicated to censoring the media, ensuring that only state-approved content was distributed. This is a sharp contrast to democratic countries, where media outlets, while sometimes criticized, remain independent. A 2020 study showed that democratic nations have 2.5 times more media freedom than authoritarian ones. The ability to access diverse viewpoints is a hallmark of democracies and a barrier to the type of propaganda seen in fascism. But even democracies aren't immune to the manipulation of public opinion. In recent years, we've seen how social media can be used to influence elections, much like propaganda in the past. For instance, Cambridge Analytica's role in the 2016 US elections is a reminder of how modern tools can be used to target voters and spread specific messages. Despite this, the key difference is that, in a democracy, the government can be held accountable for these manipulations through legal frameworks, independent investigations, and, ultimately, the voters themselves. Chapter 5: Citizens or Pawns. How the state views the individual in any political system. The individual's relationship to the state is crucial. Under democracy, the individual is seen as the cornerstone of the system. Democracy thrives when citizens are informed, active, and empowered to make decisions that impact their lives. It is built on the idea that people should have the right to live their lives freely, express their opinions, and engage in decision-making. In fact, studies have shown that countries with stronger democratic systems tend to have higher levels of happiness and individual well-being. On the flip side, fascism views the individual as part of a larger machine, where the needs of the state far outweigh personal freedoms. Fascist regimes demand total loyalty, often at the expense of individual identity. In Nazi Germany, for example, citizens were encouraged to put the needs of the state above all else. They were not encouraged to think critically or question the system, but were instead told to conform and follow orders. This view of the individual as a mere cog in the machine of the state creates a dangerous environment, one where personal freedoms are not just limited but actively oppressed. Fascist states often rely on fear to keep citizens in line. Under regimes like Mussolini's Italy or Franco's Spain, people were expected to follow the leader's orders without question. Fear of persecution, imprisonment, or worse kept the population docile. In fact, in fascist regimes, dissent was not just discouraged, it was punished, often harshly. Think about the Stalinist purges in the Soviet Union or the Gestapo in Nazi Germany. These were governments where the individual had little to no rights, and any attempt to speak out could lead to torture or death. Democracies, on the other hand, view individuals as rights bearers. In a democracy, citizens are entitled to participate in the political process, whether through voting, protesting, or petitioning. The individual is seen as a fundamental part of the system, not just a subject under the rule of law. For instance, in the US, people have the right to freely protest government actions, as seen in the civil rights movement or during the protests against the Vietnam War. This constant engagement allows citizens to influence policies and ensure that leaders are acting in their best interests. The key here is the difference in the value placed on individuals. In fascism, individuals exist to serve the state. In democracy, the state exists to serve the individuals. The success of democratic societies often depends on how well they protect and promote the rights of the individual. In fact, according to a 2019 report by the Economist Intelligence Unit, countries with stronger individual rights and freedoms rank higher on the Democracy Index, proving that personal liberty is not just a moral issue, it's a foundational pillar of a functioning democracy. Chapter 6: Violence versus Diplomacy. How conflicts are handled. Conflict is inevitable in any political system, but how it's handled is where democracy and fascism differ dramatically. In fascist regimes, violence is often the first solution to problems. Fascists use violence and intimidation to silence opposition, crush dissent, and achieve their goals. During the rise of fascism in Europe, we saw how leaders like Mussolini and Hitler used violence not only to control their citizens but also to expand their power. Fascist armies and police forces would target anyone they considered an enemy of the state, including political opponents, ethnic minorities, and ordinary citizens. Take, for example, the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when Hitler ordered the execution of political rivals within his own Nazi party. This violent purge was meant to solidify his power and send a message that opposition would not be tolerated. Fascist regimes, throughout history, have justified the use of violence as a way to maintain order, eliminate enemies, and further the state's agenda. The state becomes synonymous with power, and anyone who threatens that power is met with swift and often brutal force. Democracies, on the other hand, focus on diplomacy and peaceful solutions. While no system is without its flaws, democracies tend to prioritize negotiation and compromise over violence. This is especially evident in international relations. During the Cold War, for example, the US and the Soviet Union came close to nuclear war, but diplomacy through treaties like the SALT agreements and constant dialogue helped prevent open conflict. Diplomacy in democracies isn't just about politics, it's about finding solutions that work for the people, not forcing them into submission. The strength of a democracy lies in its ability to resolve internal and external conflicts through peaceful means. In fact, according to a study by the World Bank, democracies are 3.5 times more likely to resolve conflicts through negotiations rather than military force. Democratic nations often turn to dialogue, compromise, and international alliances to solve issues, rather than using the military as a first resort. This contrasts sharply with fascist systems, where the military is often the primary instrument of power. In the end, the contrast between violence and diplomacy is a stark reminder of the choices societies make. Fascism chooses to dominate through force, while democracy chooses to lead through dialogue. A functioning democracy knows that the best solutions come from peaceful negotiations, not the barrel of a gun. If you found this comparison insightful, don't forget to hit subscribe for more in-depth political breakdowns. We explore these critical differences and many others in future videos. Stay tuned.